Alright guys, so here's the review of the new San Martin SN0008C. So no, I'm not going crazy. This is actually a new watch from San Martin despite the old packaging. And obviously you might recognise the kind of look of the watch as well. It's very similar to a previous one they've done. So I'm actually going to be comparing this to that one you're thinking of that I've previously reviewed on the channel. Because this is the newer, slightly more budget version. San Martin watches have been getting steadily more expensive as they've been going on. Yeah, they've been increasing the quality and adding different bits and pieces, but some people are saying they're getting too much, and they have been listening. So, previous ones, such as these down here, despite all being really good watches, are a little expensive for some people. So, if you haven't seen the reviews of those, I'll leave a link to those down in the description. But as I say, this is a more budget-friendly piece. So the question is, what have they actually done to make it more budget? What things have they changed from the previous version? That's what this video is going to be going into. So as I said, this is the previous packaging that San Martin used to use if you've not seen it before. So I'm not going to go into detail on that because most of you probably have. And here's the actual watch. So it does look pretty much identical, at least on first impressions, to the previous one. And this is the previous one that I checked out that you've probably seen before. So as I say, they do look very similar when you first look at them. But the more you dig into it, there are quite a few little subtle differences. It's not just the same watch with a different movement and different bracelet, which is what I initially thought it was going to be, to be honest. But I was surprised. As I say, there's quite a few different things. Starting with the dimensions, so now let's check them out, talk about them in a bit more detail, compare the two. So starting with the diameter, they're both 40mm, so no difference there. But when it comes to the thickness, there is a slight difference between the two. With the newer one on the left, the SN0008C, that's coming in at 11.8mm, whereas the older SN0008G is coming in at 11.6. Granted, that isn't a huge difference, but it is a difference nonetheless. Probably something to do with the movement differences. And since we're talking about them, let's say what the different movements are. So with the older version, it was the PT5000 or the SW200, so that's a high beat movement, whereas this newer one is the trusty NH35. So I know a lot of people prefer that, because some people aren't that keen on the PT5000. Personally, I've not had any issues with them, but I can understand why, especially if you do start having any issues, as the NH35 is very easy to get hold of, and also very cheap as well. When it comes to the lug width, as you'd probably expect, they're both 20mm, pretty standard. But when it comes to the lug to lug, there is a fairly big difference between the two. So the older version is 47.9mm, whereas the newer one is 49.2. Both are sapphire crystal and both have 120 click bezels. But there are actually slight differences between the bezel actions, so I'll show you that now. Starting with the older model. So it's a pretty light action. Fairly clicky. Not terrible at all, lines up perfectly as well. Pretty good. But now let's compare that to the new one. So again, 120 click. It's a more crisp, clean click to it, I think. No backplay, same as the other one. It is just the sound and the feel. Slightly tighter overall, and just more clicky, as I say. Perfectly aligned again on both. So let me know down in the comments, which do you prefer? Which would you be going for, based on the bezel action? Another place where they differ is when it comes to the branding on them. So, you can see we've got that hexagonal logo on the crown here on the new one, which is matching on the dial and on the clasp. Whereas with the older version, we've just got that S that I always thought looked a little bit like a $sign, so I'm not overly keen on that. Definitely an improvement on the newer version. Another subtle difference that you probably didn't notice before, because the hands are in the way, now I've moved them, you might be able to see. So the new one says 200 meters, 660 feet, whereas the older version just said 200 meters. Otherwise, everything else on the dial is identical. Another really subtle change is when it comes to the bezel, that loom pip. So the newer one, you can see it's completely flush, inlaid into that bezel. The older version looks the same when you first look at it head on, but if you turn it to the side, you can see it is ever so slightly raised. So again, a very subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless. Another subtle difference is when it comes to the bezel, the coin edge on it. The finishing on the new one is just a bit nicer. Not as sharp as the older one, just smoothed off ever so slightly, but it doesn't affect the grip or anything. Still nice and grippy, no problems there. Whereas the older one hopefully you can see there's a sharper edge where it meets the insert, as well as just being slightly sharper overall, which can occasionally catch on things and does feel ever so slightly rough when you're actually using it as well. So a nice improvement on the new one. The most notable differences between the two though is the bracelets, for a few different reasons. So you can see, hopefully, we haven't actually got screw links on this new one. Unfortunately, they are actually pin and collar. Probably my least favourite, and based on the poll I did on the community post, a lot of you guys agree. I would have preferred if they'd just gone with split pins, to be honest. In comparison, the older version had this kind of faux rivet style look to it, which I do quite like. But unfortunately, it was also double screws, which is probably my second least favourite. And again, according to that community post I did, you guys agreed with that as well. So I guess it's a case of which are you going to go for, which is the lesser of two evils. When it comes to the finishing on both of those bracelets though, they're both really good, you can't really fault them. Nicely done, nicely brushed. And obviously we've got the polished side on both. Obviously the riveted one has got the slightly separate section with that rivet bit, which is polished. So again, just slightly more detailing, and that carries over to the clasps as well. The older one is just slightly more detailed, as well as being significantly smaller actually, which is surprising. So you've got the polished chamfer detail on the edge of that, on the older version. Whereas the newer one is completely flat. Straight edge as well. Same levels of micro adjust on both. And then when it comes to the actual fastening opening part of the clasp, they are slightly different again. The older version, just a little bit more detailed, rounded off slightly, rounded corners. And then even the pushers are actually slightly different as well. Again, they're just more rounded on the older version, compared to the straighter, more flat edge of the new one. So again, just slight little differences that save a little bit of money. So as you can see, so far, it's just loads of little things just to cut costs slightly. Very subtle differences, which aren't that noticeable when you first look, but the deeper you look, you will notice them. Where that changes slightly though, is when it comes to the loom, but not in the way you'd expect. So let's check that out now. So let's charge them both up and let's see what the differences are. So on the left we've got the new version, and on the right we've got the old one. And there we go. So initially they're looking pretty good. So we've got BGW9 on the older version, but on the newer one we've actually got BGWX1, which apparently is better than BGW9. So from what I've read, it can be up to 15 to 20% better in terms of longevity. So in my experience of testing these two out, I've noticed a little bit of difference, not a huge amount. They're still both really good, so I don't think you'd be disappointed with either of them, because you know San Martin loom's really good either way. And they're both consistent across the hands and the indices, no patchiness or anything. So I'm going to do a little bit of a time lapse here, so you can get a rough idea of what it's going to be like hopefully. So as you can see, they're pretty similar for quite a while. It's only after quite a bit that you see the older version fade ever so slightly compared to the newer one. It's not a massive difference, but with them side by side, you can see it just. And hopefully it's going to come across on camera. Not 100% sure if it will, I'll find out when I'm editing. But I think it's fairly noticeable on the hands especially. The hour hand on the newer one is definitely brighter, glowing more brightly than the older one. They're still both really good, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's a massive difference, but it's a noticeable one when you have them side by side. I don't think this is going to last long enough to actually see the difference overall in terms of longevity, because they are both so good, but you can see that there is an ever so slight difference hopefully. So the fact that the newer version, despite being cheaper, has got better loom is definitely a bonus and not something I was expecting. And we've still got no patchiness at all, still consistent across the hands and the indices on both. So as I say, really good loom as you come to expect from San Martin. So as you've seen, there's quite a lot going on here. There's definitely more differences than you'd expect looking at these initially side by side. As I said at the start of the video, I thought it was just going to be a case of different movement, different bracelet, that was it. But there's a lot of little subtle differences. Some to cut costs, some to improve things. But the question is, how does all this affect the actual price? How much can you pick these two watches up for? So obviously AliExpress prices vary quite a bit in terms of sales and stuff, but I've been told by San Martin that the newer version is going to be significantly cheaper than the older one. So at the time of writing this, the prices are, for the new one, actually no, I'll start with the old one. The old one is £230, which is about $278, about €264. And in comparison, the newer one is coming in at £170, which is about $205 and about €195. So a pretty significant price difference for watches that, on the surface, appear to be pretty much identical. But the question is, which of the two are you leaning more towards? Which would you go for if it was a toss-up between the two? I think the main things it's going to come down to is whether you value having a high beat movement or not, and also whether you prefer the rivet style bracelet or the more standard bracelet of the newer version. Obviously there are a lot of other little subtle differences, but those are the main two, at least in terms of how it's going to wear day to day and how you're going to use it. The other things are just little attentions to detail that differ between them, so they're not overly important unless you're the kind of person who focuses on those little details and they're what's important to you. Either way though, I don't think you can really go wrong with either watch. You're going to be getting a really good piece either way, because San Martin always produce good quality stuff. But as I say, it depends which way you're going to lean, how much you're willing to spend, what you value more. While you're mulling that one over, I'll show you what they're both like on wrist, so you can see if there is any difference in how they wear as well. So first up, here's the older model on my 7-inch wrist with that rivet style bracelet. Does wear really nicely, and as I say, I do like that clasp with the polished chamfered details on. And here's the newer one, so it still looks really good. If I didn't have the other one to compare side by side, I'd be more than happy with this one. Yeah, the lug-to-lug is ever so slightly larger, but as long as you've got a 7-inch wrist or above, I think you'd be absolutely fine. Perhaps if you've got a smaller than 7-inch wrist, this might not work for you, because it is getting close to that 50mm. That being said though, there are details on this one I do prefer over the other one. That bezel, for one, it's a lot less sharp than the other one, and the action just feels a bit nicer. It's also nice having the more consistent branding on this one, with that hexagonal logo on the crown. So again, the question is, where would your money be going? Would you be going for the newer version, or would you be going for the older one? If you're interested in either of them, I'll put links down in the description to both. But that's it for this one guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.